we are here to learn from the award-winning researcher and author, Dr. Barry Popkin. Dr. Popkin has a doctorate in agricultural economics from Cornell University and a background in economics and political activism. He has explored obesity dynamics, dietary and physical activity patterns, and health policies across the globe. He has conducted public health research in 5 continents and more than 20 countries. So he really is global in his approach. On top of writing his book, The World is Fat, Dr. Popkin is author to more than 460 peer-reviewed journal articles and is one of the most cited nutrition scholars in the world. Really inspires me to go home and start writing after the lecture is done. Dr. Popkin carries his expertise in several impressive titles, including the W.R. Keenan Jr. Distinguished Professor of Nutrition, the Carlos Smith Chambly Distinguished Professor of Global Nutrition, Fellow with the Carolina Population Center, Director of the Nutrition Transition Research Program, member of the Linebarger Comprehensive Cancer Center, and he is also on the editorial board of the Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. One interesting fact about Dr. Popkin is his dad owned a furniture store, and so did my dad. So we have a little common element there. So his presentation today is titled, The World is Fat, Child Obesity and Food Systems Dynamics. Please welcome this year's lectureship awardee, Dr. Barry Popkin.
Thank you. Hi. So I don't have a lot of time, as it turns out, and so I want to kind of lead you through a story. I want to give you a little bit of background to let you think about the broad transition we've had across the globe in the way we eat, drink, and move, and then move on to talk a little about some of the obesity dynamics across the globe, focusing more on low and middle income countries. You realize our country, the UK, and Australia are 3 of the fattest countries in the world, but there are a number of other countries of equal unfortunate proportions in health and adiposity that I'll talk about. And then talk a little about physical activity, global diet change, some of the food system shifts that are really changing the whole globe very rapidly in the way the globe is eating and drinking, and what's going on around the world that's really, some countries are trying to aggressively take on this problem. So I begin with trying to remind you that if you knew where we were 10 to 50,000 years ago, we were tall, we ate a very varied diet, we drank water, and we were very, very active. Many of us died from diseases, but those that lived actually were taller. In India, they were a couple meters tall if you went back and looked in some of the archaeological record. And we got shorter as we moved to a simpler diet, as we moved forward into kind of the agricultural periods, and we started eating less and less diverse diet, and we still kept drinking water, and we still worked very hard, so we weren't fat. But we started creating different deficiency diseases that didn't exist before because of kind of the nature of the way the food supply and other kinds of problems and seasonality that hit us in harder ways. And then we reached kind of more of an industrial era and moved forward into what we think of as today, where we are, where we eat a lot of processed food, we drink caloric beverages instead of water, we don't move much, and we've really suffered from that. And we want to now kind of refine our world, somehow change, go back to food or to healthier whatever we buy. We want to shift and go back to being active physically. We want to move back to drinking water, tea, and coffee, and healthy beverages. And we want to kind of become healthy again, which is not going to be simple. And the reason it's not simple is because our biology gives us certain preferences. I'll talk about each of these as I go through my lecture, and I won't do them now. But modern technology has kind of faced us with the whole world, which has changed the availability, the whole kind of environment we're in, which has kind of conflicted with our biology. And I'll talk about that as I move through, because it's that conflict that is being utilized by industry and others to kind of give us this whole new way of eating, drinking, and moving, and that has created the world where we are today and is changing the world globally. So now, if I think about the low and middle income world first, I'm not going to talk about the US, the UK, Australia, which are equally heavy among high income countries. Australia may have a few more fat children than we do. UK and US and Australian adult women are the same. Our men are slightly heavier, but we're really not so different. It's low-income countries. There are a number of low-income countries, truly low, where obesity is equally there for reasons I'll explain later. And I want to give you a little idea about that, because the globe, every country in the world, is moving over. So our body mass index, which is kind of our weight over our height cubed, so it's kind of a roundness. And if it's over 25, we say that you're overweight. Over 30, we say you're obese on a global level. And it's moving. It's shifting in very big ways. But what's equally bad is, for reasons we don't understand, is our waists are getting bigger. Our waists are getting bigger relative to every part of us. And it's the fat around the heart and the liver that truly is the most dangerous part in terms of a lot of different kinds of diseases, both cancers and cardiovascular. So that we're changing. And it's happening to adults across the globe. It happens later to children, and I'll give you some sense of that. So if I were to take weighted averages for each region in the world and the low and middle income countries, leaving out Europe, the US, Canada, you see the Middle East and North Africa, this proportion are overweight and obese. And the levels of diabetes there are really high. Then as you go down, Latin America got overweight earlier, but it's at about this level in general, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia are very high. And then you move down to the biggest part of the world, South Asia and East Asia, and the rate of increase is the highest in the world, where half the globe's population lives. But they're in the urban areas. This is the urban, this is overweight. This is then the proportions underweight, weighted from very large samples representative of each country with exact same scales and measurement and sampling for across these regions. This is the rural area. And you'll see pretty high levels of overweight and somewhat, because of India, higher levels of underweight in South Asia only among adult women. And if you looked at this, you're looking at adolescents. And adolescents across the globe in the low and middle income world, except in Latin America, aren't so overweight yet. It happens between adolescence and adulthood. Right in that period when women are starting to get pregnant, men are starting to change, and somehow it changes very quickly, the whole weight pattern in ways we don't understand. But much more underweight, much less overweight, but still quite high in the Middle East and Latin America. And as I'll show you in a second, for Mexico. And in this one, as you see, for the non-pregnant girls who are if you can see up in this age group, you can see the differences. It varies a lot by country. And if you look at the underweight, for the teenagers, it's higher. But as you go up, all of a sudden, 2, 3, 4 years later, they all of a sudden start gaining weight, and it really shifts. Now, this is preschoolers. So notice, even among preschoolers, overweight in many, many countries is very high in the urban areas compared to underweight. And in the rural areas, there's a lot less compared. But this underweight is based on stunting, which is kind of an accumulation over 5 years in low and middle income countries, and is mainly occurring in the infancy, weaning period, when people either stop breastfeeding or never breastfed. And it's a different kind of, it's not a current. This is Mexico. This is what's happening in every country. This is a BMI distribution. This is an obesity cutoff, and you can see how each year that they've done a nationally representative survey, how it's moved over from 9 to 20, how it's moving up the obesity levels in that country. The highest in the low and middle income world and equal to us. And with it, very high levels of diabetes. The same for all the Hispanics in this country. Very high levels of diabetes at lower. And this is Mexico, just seeing in children. You can see in the children and adolescents, where the growth has occurred, and you can see in adults, and it was much lower in the adolescent girls than it was at this point in the 80s, and it was in the 90s that you started the women and the adolescents. So, but Mexico is actually now not so different than us in the way they eat, drink, and move at all, as you might expect for lots of reasons. But all the rest of Latin America and Central America are not very different either. So I'm not going to go into this part very much, but there's something very mysteriously going on around across the globe, where even in a bunch of high-income countries where we had nationally representative data, as well as low-income countries, we are getting fatter around the waist relative to if we're gaining weight elsewhere. So, which is, from a health point of view, meaning the risks of bad health as weight goes up is getting worse. So there's something that we still don't quite understand its causes, but it probably relates to a combination of diet and activity in ways that we don't fully understand yet. So I'm going to move on, and I want to talk about physical activity for a minute. I just wanted to give you that background. The world is really heavy. When I started talking about this in the 1990s, we probably had about 1.5 billion underweight people in the world, and we had approximately 600 to 700 million overweight. Today we have over 2 billion overweight, and the rates of increase, if I were to show you, are really quite rapid for overweight, and the rates of decline for underweight are equally rapid. So we are shifting to the point where we have about 600 to 700 million underweight individuals, but if going down very rapidly. And in contrast, we have 2 billion going on 2.5 billion overweight individuals in the world. And part of it, a big cause, in fact, is the rapid change in activity. That doesn't mean it's the solution, but it is a cause. And I'm going to use a measurement that I'll explain very briefly. This is what they call METs. It's some metabolic equivalent, but if it were about 180 or 190, it means, including sleeping, this excludes it. This is time-use studies from the 60s, and they changed methods. But just, I wanted to point out the starting point in the US and where we ended up. And then for TV, we watch about 40 hours adults in the country on a nationally representative basis. And so this is the level. So we're at a point where we don't move very much. The average adult hardly does very much effort. I don't care whether you're a farmer sitting on your tractor and using all your computers to do everything, or whether you're working in a factory, where you are, there isn't a lot of activity in general across the American population. There are subsets of populations, of course, migrant workers and others, but they're a tiny piece of the country. And then let's look at China. This is every 2 years we did these surveys following around 20,000 Chinese. And they started at a much higher level than us. We were probably here in the 30s at this level of activity. But by the end, they were about where we were 20 or 30 years ago. And their level of activity is going down really rapidly. That's what the changes in modern technology. China opened up its market. All sorts of technology came in. Cars, buses, little tiny tractors that farmers could use that cost maybe $100, sprays, kind of automation in factories, computers, everything else. And the Chinese are moving down, had both in terms of work, home production, transportation, and no leisure activity to speak of. So trivial, it's amazing. And then their TV time is moving up. And if I had the same kind of data, which we don't have for any country where we've collected every 2 years, really detailed, you'd see the same kind of trend in the low and middle income countries. So this is a bigger cause of the Chinese rapid increases in weight. However, it's not a solution, because if you think about drinking a Coke and how long it would take you to run, how many, an hour or 3/4 of an hour, depending on how fast you run, to offset that one Coke, you can imagine what it takes to offset the thousands of calorie change that went on when people moved to from this high to low activity regime, which is what's happened globally. And it's now happening in Africa, in rural areas, It's slower, but it's starting to happen. It's really happening to populations across the world. So activity is important. It's important for our health, and I don't want to denigrate it at all. But for a solution to the global obesity problems and diabetes, we want activity, and we need to push it, but we also need to deal with our food systems and understand what we're eating and how it's changing. And that's where we think we're going to have most of our solutions to deal with the problem, because it's easier to get you to stop drinking or eating some little thing than it is to get you to run a mile or walk 5 miles or whatever, as you can imagine. So when we think of the global food increases, and I'm going to go through a few of these in a minute, the sweetening of our diet. In the US, we went through the barcodes for a 5-year period, the ingredients. 75% of our foods have added sugar in them, of our foods and the beverages combined. That is how much added sugar is being added across the globe into the food supply when you can get the whole nationally representative sample of what we purchase and kind of where how much it has added sugar. So we're sweetening the globe's diet in amazing ways. Not just what we drink, but what we drink, for reasons I'll show you, is much more powerful for its health effects. We're also eating more animal food, not necessarily in this country, but across the globe. If India eats a little bit more dairy, or China eats a little more pork or poultry, huge increases in world prices. And that's what's going on. But probably more pernicious is this shift to very refined carbohydrates. Not only sugar in our diet, but just all the refined carbohydrates. The average child in America, the average adolescent, 3/4 of their food comes from this highly processed grain-based desserts and sugary beverages. So this is a US problem, and it's a global issue. This we all understand, and I'll talk about the snacking part in a second. One that's very unique to low-income countries is a huge increase in vegetable oils. And what's common across the globe, beans for low-income Americans was a huge part of the diet in the 60s. It's gone today. We showed in one article a crossing of the diet shifts between low and high income between the 60s and the present, and it's just part of the nature of the way diets have shifted in this country. And food preparation time. We spend in the US 27 minutes on the average from our time use studies in food preparation. Hard to believe. That doesn't mean some of you don't cook, but for every one of you that cooks, there's somebody else that just preheats stuff or heats up ready to eat, ready to heat kinds of food constantly. So think of how we've changed and how we handle food. Think of where we started long ago cooking, how we've shifted over time when we began to finally get oil, salt, and sugar into our diet in serious ways, and how we've moved up in the 1880s, 90s on. We developed canning, pasteurization, all these kinds of things. But really, it's been and genetics were created even earlier, but really began to be used in major ways after post-World War II. And now our diet is dominated by very highly processed kinds of foods in very huge ways. I'll show you that in a minute. So sweetness, I want to talk about that. We love sweetness. But let's talk about water and beverages. I don't know if you know it, but if you don't drink for 3 to 7 days, you'll die. But you could live, shockingly, for 2 months without food. So if you can imagine back under hunter-gatherers periods, how food was very occasional and very seasonal. They'd find their deer, they'd find their wild animal, they'd find their fish, they'd find their game, whatever it is. But it was they'd eat it when they could. They ate anything with fat as much as they could and accumulated, but they went without, but they had to drink all the time. So somehow, for reasons we don't understand, when we drink something, our calories in the day are higher. But if we eat, instead of drinking watermelon juice, we eat the watermelon, we get sated, and we don't eat more. The same for coconut milk versus coconut meat, and milk versus cheese. When we drink something, it's disconnected with our food intake. So if you go from drinking water, tea, or coffee without sugar to drinking juice, Coke, smoothies, you think you're full and sated, but it goes to your system really quickly, and your total diet in the day doesn't change for reasons we don't understand, which is part of the reason a lot of people are trying to get rid of soft drinks, and even others are trying to get rid of juices and other stuff in our diet. And it is a piece of what changed in the US more than in most countries. We, above all countries, were the biggest consumers of added sugar and sugar in our beverages. And that is how we shifted. And I want to give you a sense, though. It's not every American. So this is children. Each of these are 20% on a nationally representative data at different points going forward. So you see at the top group of children and adults, this is 2 to 18-year-olds, this is adult. Most of that added sugar, by the way, is among adolescents and young adults. And if you see the top groups, we've gone down, but the top 20% consume 700 calories. The next 20%, 400 calories. And if you then went to the age groups of 10 to 30, where much of it's consumed, you'd even see much higher levels. So it's not that everybody's drinking all this stuff and everybody's eating all the sugary foods. It's just that the subset that are really getting a lot of it. And that's the group where changes to try to cut the sugar out of the diet, cut the sugar out of the beverages, drink other kinds of things is really critical. So the next thing, and this is really something that's very hard for Americans to understand, that if you went to the 1940s or 1900, there was no place in the globe where people snacked. Whereas today, the average American has 3 snacks a day, from 2 and older. Think about the manufactured eating behaviors. That is something that, and today it's not just us, all 3 of these countries with nationally representative surveys, same percentage of calories from snacking. The Mexicans, the Brazilians, they didn't have snacks back 50, 100 years ago. You look back in history across the world, only in special holidays or the nobility or others did they even have the words and terms in their diet. So the Chinese at the New Year's had it and other things, but that's it. And so snacking is one of the things that the food industry has done to us, and you keep pushing more meals across the globe, and it's one of the things we see changing very rapidly. A country like China, when I started doing national surveys there in the 80s, 1 gram of sugar per capita and no snacks. Then starting around, they now have sugar reserves. It's that much sugar in their diet from going from that, along with pork reserves. They're so worried about sugar prices going up or down, and up particularly and affecting people's, getting people mad. So the reality is that we've manufactured that eating behavior, and the globe is shifting in the same way that we've shifted. And it's a very interesting kind of example of what our way of eating, meaning the modern food industry, and it's not just Coke and Pepsi, it's also Unilever, Nestle, and companies across the globe, and then it's local companies in every country, are pushing that kind of behavior, and it's one of the major marketing areas. The third one, which is very unique to the low and middle income world, is vegetable oils, and that's unique because we developed butter and lard were all we had for fat, really, in 1950. We had difficulty with the amount of fat and oil in our food supply in the 40s. And so the Japanese and the US together kind of worked out this new technology to get oil out of corn or soybeans or all sorts of other products. That's not the squeezing of olive oil that went on traditionally in the Mediterranean, but kind of the modern oils that are across. This is before Crisco, but it came together. And they made it all very cheap. That technology didn't hit the low and middle income world because of trade barriers and other things really until the 80s and 90s. But I'll just give you an example, show you just thinking of how the diets changed across the globe. And look at China. This is grams, and this is the calories down here. The percentage of their calories that come from oil. This is like, there's like 9 calories in a gram of sugar, of oil. So we're talking about 300-400 calories for the average person of oil. And it's going up, as you can see, every couple of years. It just keeps going up and up. In our survey we're doing next year, I don't know what it'll be, but the reality is that it continues to rise. And The next issue is animal food. And I'm only using, again, the example of China because this is what's happened in every Asian country. Latin America started eating animal food much earlier and has fairly high levels of beef consumption and so forth. But in Asia and Africa, it's a new phenomenon that's grown, particularly the two giants, India for dairy and China for poultry and beef. As you can see how it's growing for the pork. You can see how it's growing for the eggs. You can see for the poultry here how it's really growing. And this per capita amount is really has a major effect on the globe. And while if I were going to put on my environmental hat, there's a lot of negative sides to all this animal food intake for the globe. But of course, we consume 4 times what they consume. So if we're not going to change, the world's not going to change in any way. But that's a major climate issue. So then we think about recent trends and what's going on. We have actually changed. The US and the UK, because of the pressure that we've had from the media, from public health people, from worrying about child obesity, from the First Lady, everything together. In the last decade, both the US and the UK have really shifted. And I'll give you a little bit of example. This is food purchases of beverages. And you can see the decline for households, particularly with children. They have really declined a lot in the calories of beverages they consume, also food, but relatively speaking, bigger. And what's happened is we've moved away from soft drinks. And this is the food purchases for, in general, the big decline for the households with kids. And that shows you in a different way, using 2000 as the starting point, nationally representative sample of food purchases, which is about 2/3 of our calories, and actually about 70% of our beverage, 75%. And you see the large decline in the calories from beverages relative and how it's grown. That's because we've moved away toward more diet beverages, toward lower calorie beverages, toward all sorts of water and so forth. We're actually per capita wise, not per capita, but as a nation, the biggest bottled water consumers on the aggregate. But it's only in whites. Now, relative to whites, this is blacks. And it was moving down. They were cutting their calories. They don't waste as much as we do. White Americans waste about half of what we buy. They waste much, much less. But you see how all of a sudden here, targeted marketing went toward blacks and Hispanic households. They developed these channels. And colleagues of mine have documented the changes in marketing strategies, and you see how the calories purchased started changing. So now I want to just kind of talk for a second, put on my academic hat. You have heard all about Supersizing of America. And the norm is, because of the movie and the books and all of that, that's what's created the increased caloric intake in this country. Really, it's the increased eating events. We went from 3 meals a day to 6. And those snacks went from 10 to 40 calories a day to 300 a day per snack. So when we've decomposed in some very visible publications and figured out it's the eating frequency has been a much bigger cause of the calorie increase that went on in the US between the 70s and 80s and the last decade. Than the portion sizing. Portion sizes has a role, but not as big, and energy density doesn't have a big role when it's the overall meal. It's really been the number of times we eat a day has had the biggest effect. So that's kind of background. Then let's think of what's happening in the future and what's happening to the whole globe. Think of the way our farming system. If you went back to 1950, our government defined our farming system. We gave huge trillions of dollars of subsidies. We created a whole agricultural system focused on giving enough grain and then animal food and focusing on cash crops. And we did a brilliant job. That system today is not run by the government anymore. agribusinesses buy directly from farmers, retailers buy from farmers, the Whole Foods, whoever, the H-E-Bs, whoever you are, buy directly from farmers and have contracts with them. The same thing goes for the Nestle's and Pepsi's and Cokes. And so the controls over our farm system in the US and also the McDonald's, they have their farms that they work with. So these four players, which are important in the US, have become global players and are slowly across the globe taking over control of agriculture and working directly with farmers. And so it's changed really quite significantly the ability of governments to deal with kind of what's being grown and how it's handled and so forth. And so that's something to understand. And I'm not going to, this is a little too complex, but farming in our country went through huge changes in post-World War II. We had technology from the 1800s and the early 1900s up to World War II, but we had very few reapers before World War II, a few thousand. We were very unmodernized and unmechanized in the agriculture system. After World War II, we built railroads into places, we built highways, we mechanized agriculture, we put literally trillions of dollars in the 50s and 60s. And we took animal beef prices, went down to a quarter of what they were actually on the global market level by doing that. We really created a cheap food supply for grains and for sugar and for animal foods. And the result is the diet we have today. Partly we shifted. If you've ever seen price changes, you've seen fruit and vegetables in real terms have quadrupled. Oils have gone down, sugar's gone down, animal foods has gone down. So the diet we're buying today is really the result of government policy, but done because we thought it was healthy. We thought having a high-protein diet back in 1950 was what we needed. We thought having a lot of animal food in our diet was what we needed. But as our knowledge changed and as our disease pattern changed, we had already built up lobby groups to fit the old way of the farming. And now I want to talk about the retail sector because it is so critical to what's happening in the low-income world today. Think about how recent is modern shopping for anything other than real food. Back before World War II, there were a tiny number of grocery stores, tiny number of packaged foods. Mainly people bought food in them and you know, maybe refrigerated milk or other kinds of things, but very little beyond. The chains, think of how Walmart's is only 40, 45 years old. The big chains across the globe are really new, and the growth in this retail sector is really quite surprising in Latin. I'm just using Latin America as a simple example. 15 to 20% of the peso in 1990 went for retail packaged food. 60% by 2000, as I'll show you in a slide from Mexico, just the percentage of calories that are from bar-coded packaged processed food, you'll get an idea of the change. And this is happening everywhere in the globe now. It first was Latin America, then it was really the high-income Gulf states and others, then it was urban Asia, now into rural Asia, then urban Africa, now into rural, and it's a global phenomenon today. And what are they getting? This is what we get. In terms of beverages, this is the percent that are highly processed with tons of chemicals, tons of ingredients in them. And when I say tons, I mean when the barcode is 10 or 15 ingredients, but that really has like, each of those have 30 to 40 items in them if you could see what they are. And this is over 60% of our calories from food comes from very processed food. And that's what's happening to the globe. In Mexico, we did a national survey. We looked for each item that they ate. We saw where it came from, and if it came with a barcode or something, we labeled it as such. And look across the country, 58% of the calories in 2012 came from packaged processed food. Look at Mexico City, but even in the rural areas, even in the middle of these lovely little villages in the middle of nowhere that you think about eating kind of the homemade tortillas and so forth, that's how much was packaged of their calories. So you're talking about over half the calories for everybody in that country in general came from packaged processed food. And in China, where when I started there was not a single supermarket in the country, except a couple little cash stores. If you had dollars and were in the elite or a foreigner, you could buy some packaged processed food. After about 2000, still, none of our villages had it. Within 4 years, every village had a convenience store in all of the 300 or so that we're surveying, and I'm sure we're in some very poor provinces. So the percentage of calories is much smaller. This is Shanghai, Beijing, and Chongqing, 3 cities over 20 to 40 million each, and it's only a third of their calories or so in that survey, but they're growing at 50% a year in China, the retail sector. I'm sure in the survey we're doing this fall and summer, we're going to probably find 50 to 60% of calories already in that country coming from packaged processed food. So that's the change that's gone on across the globe. So what's happening? I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but I want to give you a sense that in the low and middle income world, they're really moving quickly to make changes. Mexico, our neighbor next door, under the previous president, really was concerned. The very high levels of obesity, growing levels of diabetes, hypertension, major, major problem. Not unlike what they find in all the cities and rural areas in Texas. Very high, serious heart disease, cardiovascular problems, followed by cancers. But Mexico couldn't afford to deal with all those diabetics. Very few of them are treated, and a lot of them have really serious complications. So the first thing they did was started a beverage panel. They wanted to kind of educate the country about beverages and decide what was good and bad, and they did a national agreement on obesity, where they dealt with mainly the beverages. They wanted to push to get a healthy diet. They wanted to deal with added sugar, saturated fat, trans fats, and they really wanted to kind of deal with a lot of parts of the diet that were very unhealthful. To deal with the schools, they actually negotiated. We negotiated over several years with the food companies to kind of come up with an agreement to get soft drinks out of the schools, to get them, except for the high schools where they get some limited access, no juice and stuff, and the younger kids, and get the junk food out of the schools. And they don't sell it in the schools like we do here, but they have vendors they allow in. So it's a question what they allowed the vendors to sell that came into the schools. And did a number of other things. I actually led a panel on one of the major things that they pushed, which was putting on a label. It just was a healthy product based on each food group and certain criteria that the scientists in Mexico developed. And then a conservative government came in. But by that time, also who came in was the Bloomberg philanthropies wanting a sugary beverage tax, which we had recommended, and we're pushing for a 20% tax. The president was up against it. There was a huge media battle. Actually, the public health side won, and almost 60% of Mexicans felt they needed a sugary beverage tax. Even somebody in the very conservative party, a lady senator, led the charge in the Senate, and the Senate wanted a 20% tax. So what did they do? The president said, we'll do a 10% beverage tax, kind of to try to co-opt the bigger one. And then as Minister of Finance, very aware of the healthcare costs and other costs to diabetes and stuff, added a junk food tax, a huge comprehensive set of junk food tax that covers what anybody might think of as kind of different kinds of junk food. We don't know the effect yet. We have some general ideas. We're involved with our colleagues in Mexico in evaluating it, and essentially after the first 3 months of 2014, we had very positive effects, but we don't. And people were drinking more water, less soft drinks. They didn't move to beer like the industry was telling us they were going to, and they actually shifted their beverage intake, and they cut back their junk food purchases. So we don't know the long-term effects. We're just in the midst of working out the year-long data in the first set of evaluations, and we've got a long way to go to truly understand all the effects on overall eating patterns. But these are small taxes. This is not like other countries are doing, and we'll come back on that. So what's going on across the globe? This is the only set of tools we're truly working on the most. One is price subsidies, trade controls, and taxes, and we found out the trade controls don't work because of the World Trade Organization, so subsidies and taxation are really the main things. A second thing that countries are doing, and I'll give you some examples, are labeling on the front of packages. A big one is controlling marketing, and I'll talk about that. And the fourth one is doing things like getting junk food and soft drinks and other beverages that are not healthy out of the schools. And then almost nobody's working directly on the food system part yet. Only a couple. I'll give you examples of that. And education, one country, nothing's been successful. And I'll talk about each of these. So Mexico, I mentioned. A number of the Pacific Islands, that's the Samoa, Fijis, all of these countries have taxes, big taxes that they're putting in to try. But these are countries have 80–90% of the population overweight, 50 to 70% have diabetes, heart disease, really a different world, but tiny little countries. But they finally, in the last 4 or 5 years, started saying, we've got to do things. We've got to change the diet. It's going to be very hard for them because they've got a long way to go, given the problem in the countries, and that they're completely rely on importation of food. Right now, Chile's in the midst of vote. Half the country, half the Senate, I think, has voted for a 20% beverage tax. I got around 4 other countries that are probably within 3 years will have a beverage tax. So we will have those to see what they do. We don't know what it will do. It's not enough. It's only one little piece of the diet. It just happens to be the low-hanging fruit because it doesn't affect what else you eat that much. And it has no health benefit, those kind of beverages. Even if they fortify Coke with vitamin C, it really doesn't have a health benefit. And so we'd like to tax the grams of sugar in beverages, but it's too hard to do. So generally, everybody's taxing the beverages by ounce or something. And different countries are doing it different ways, but we're all doing it at the excise level when we can, so everybody sees the tax. Import controls didn't work. We tried trade controls in the Western Pacific country. They brought in things like from the US, you've never heard of turkey tails, but fried turkey tails, pure fat, was the most popular food in some parts of the Western Pacific. Well, one of our turkey farmers took them to court. They broke World Trade Organization rules, but they changed it, so they taxed all turkey tails in the country equally, if they're in the country or out, and they can do that. So we've just learned that we can't use trade barriers in the way that we had hoped we could. The front of the package labeling is very interesting. You see in the US these little boxes that the industry puts on the top. They call them GDAs, or Guidelines for Daily Allowance. They're really meaningless. They haven't helped anybody do anything, and they're ignored. But there are 2 ways countries are doing it. And one, we've got successes, and we know that it's changed reformulation and made products healthier and has worked. And that's a positive logo based on each food group, where you put on it, like, if this is a healthy oil, or this is a healthy grain-based, let's say, ready-to-eat cereal or something, low in sugar, high in fiber, lower in sodium, and so forth, you give it a positive logo. And that's pushed reformulation in a very big way in the countries that have instituted already. And a number of Asian countries now are moving to do it. Mexico did it, but hasn't been implemented because of the new government change. They kind of implemented a lame version of it. There are negative logos, and I'm going to show you an example. A stoplight for specific items, and I'll give you an example in the next slide on that. And then there are the countries that have banned images and done all sorts of things like that. The ideal thing that a couple countries in Asia are going to do, and I'm hoping one in Latin America, I think also Chile, is to link marketing and labeling together. So you can't market anything that's labeled unhealthy if it's chili, or anything that's not labeled healthy in the other country that's going to do this. And this is what Chile's going to put on their labels. So too much sugar, too much sodium, too much fat, it's going to be on the logo like that. And it's going to be a big size so that you can't miss it. Now, will it affect behavior? It will certainly force some reformulation by the industry to some extent. How much behavior will affect? We don't know yet. We have no studies on the negative logos and their effects on purchases or reformulation yet. So that's another one. The next thing is the food environment, and I'll talk about it a little bit as we move along. One of the things is marketing controls. And when it's been done only on children's TV, it's been worthless. They just, because the children watch maybe a third of children's TV and the other 2/3 is other stuff, and they move the ads to the other shows. It's been documented in a couple countries that have done that. So we're generally now pushing from 6 a.m. to 10 or 11 p.m., no marketing of the unhealthy foods, or only of the healthy foods. And that's what a couple countries are moving toward. But it hasn't been there yet. It's all still children's stuff. But it's going to be the next generation of these. The food environment's an interesting one. Schools, now probably around 30 countries have banned soft drinks in the schools. Around 8 have banned juices in the schools. And countries like Mexico, after the beverage panel, they were getting so much calories from their milks, they shifted all the government's 20 million people from whole milk, which is about 3.8% fat, 4% fat, down to 1.5% as the first step. Just kind of very quickly cut a hunk of calories out. Is it a good thing or not? Now we're starting to not understand and be so sure, but that's kind of at the point in time where science was. I'm going to show you Brazil in a second. Chile's law on marketing is very interesting, but I'm not going to go into it very much. It's very detailed. I want to talk about Brazil for a second, though. Brazil was brilliant. They did what a lot of people in food systems here would like. They said 30% of food has to come from local farms, and 70% has to be real food in the school feeding program that was nationally funded. And they've monitored it. They haven't evaluated its impact, but presumably, at least for that meal, I don't know about the rest of the day, it made an impact. But we don't really have the evaluations to know, unfortunately. Singapore has done something that other Asian countries are thinking about. They took all the hawkers. You know, you've got all these food trucks around here. Well, if you think of any Asian or African country, you have millions of these little hawkers all over the place cooking at night. And if you're in a country like Thailand, that's all you do is eat it. Well, they put them together and they could start to work with them on healthier oils, sanitation rules, healthier cooking. And they've been doing all that in Singapore. Very interesting kind of push. We've been pushing for farmers markets. The low-income world has been pushing away. Retailers have taken over. We have more farmers markets in North Carolina than Mexico. I mean, it's crazy, the difference and the shifts that we're going from one to the other. The rest of this really hasn't been dealt with. Hardly anything trying to control the restaurant or retail sector yet. That will change in the future, but it hasn't yet. Education is interesting. Think of the billions of dollars that are spent on marketing. Then think of the pennies that we spend on education. And it hasn't worked anyplace, really, where there's any documentation of it. But Thailand's trying this program where they have, for every 10 people in a village, they've educated these promotion people that are going out and talking to the village, and their whole thing is about cut your waste and cut out sweetness. And it's the most extensive program, and we won't know for a while what its impact is, but it will be evaluated, and we'll see. So low and middle income countries are just in the beginning. Within the next 5 years, I can't tell you how many countries are going to have instituted any of the three I talked about: the taxation, the marketing controls, the front of the label profiling. They're all doing things in schools. None yet are working in other governments, but they're starting to think about government hospitals and buildings and other facilities where they can control it. And they're kind of going to lead the way, and we're going to be able to evaluate them as it happens and get some evidence that these things work. Will that have an impact back on us? Well, it certainly mattered for San Francisco and Berkeley having the positive effect in the Mexican taxes. So it might. We don't know what it's going to do, but it's happening. But the difficulty is a lot of these countries also face malnutrition. But what all of a sudden has become a confluence between the food insecurity and the food security is that infants are being weaned on Cokes and potato chips and other stuff like that today in the third world. So you go to African villages, and all of a sudden the hunger people that hated me, thinking I'm taking money for obesity away from them, now they want to work together because it's the same common enemy. And so there's a lot more confluence of the two kind of problems today than there were before that. And so that's the end of my talk, and we're now got